Welcome back. I'm speaking today with Lauren Spohn, and is it doctor? Not yet?
Not yet.
Not yet doctor?
No, a doctor hopefully in development.
Okay, very
Same
good.
as Newman, actually.
And we're talking today because you're studying Newman.
I am.
And we're here at Oxford, and it seems like an appropriate place to talk about the great John Henry Newman. And so tell our viewers a little bit about who is Newman and why should we care at all about him?
Great, yes. Well, first of all, I think, first and finally, Newman is a great friend. And I think you see this over the course of his entire life. And for more historical context, he was an English theologian, philosopher, poet, and deep man of prayer, and now a saint. His dates were 1801 to 1890. And he was made a cardinal in 1879 and then canonized in 2019. And he is perhaps most famous for his conversion from the Anglo-Catholic Church to the Catholic Church in 1845. So before all of this happened, he was a scholar and a man of letters and a man of deep learning in the early church fathers. He was a fellow here at Oriel College from 1822 to 1845 when he converted. Before that, he was an undergraduate at Trinity College and studied maths and classics. And so it's pretty fascinating to be here and to study in his footsteps, as it were. And he was also a pastor and a curate at St. Clement's, just by Cowley Road, and rector, I believe, of the University Church, where he delivered his famous Oxford University Church sermons. And all throughout his life, he was very preoccupied with questions of faith and reason, and how one comes to know the truth, and how one can, through a series of conversions, come to an ever closer and more intimate grasp of who and what the truth is. And so he started off life, I think, as a young man, very keenly aware that he was God's creature, as he puts it. You know, he could sort of see within himself this truth of which his being was so full, which he is a creature of God, the Creator. So he started off as a kind of evangelical convert from that awareness around like 1816, I believe is the date, and then was a pretty staunch evangelical before coming here to Oxford, where he started to move from evangelical Calvinist leanings toward more of a kind of liberal position on church doctrine at the time, and then eventually found his way to leading the Anglo-Catholic Oxford movement, which was an attempt with Newman and some of his other friends at Oriel to recall the Anglican Church back to her sacramental and apostolic roots. So he and his friends wanted to recover the early intuitive, deeply prayerful Christianity that was very much in touch with the fathers of the church, Augustine, the Cappadocian fathers, the pre-apostolic, pre-Nicaea, ways of relating to God. And then from that movement, which you can still see all around Oxford today, he ended up finding his way to Rome, and then in 1845 converted. But apart from that, Newman is a great theologian. You know, he writes much about the fathers and the history of the early church, and particularly the way that the current doctrine of the Roman Church developed from, just kind of like the Gospels to the creeds. How does that happen, and how does, our kind of propositional truth reconcile with the fact that it has a history? And so because of this, Newman's often referred to as really the first modern Catholic thinker to start putting the tradition in dialogue with its own history. And he's known as the father of Vatican II, and a great influence on the late Pope Benedict XVI, as well as JP2 and many other of the Nouvelle Theologique theologians that we all know and love, the kind of Communio school. Apart from all of this too, Newman as a philosopher has such a fascinating place in intellectual history, because he's writing in a 19th century where Catholic philosophy has not really engaged the great challenges of modern philosophy, which is namely a turn to the subject and a turn to inward experience and a kind of application of this universal skepticism as a method to questions of truth and even my own being and what counts as knowledge, etc. And so Newman, as many 20th century philosophers now read him, was the first one to try to think about, okay, well, how do I, starting from my own experiences of God, as I just mentioned previously, this truth of which my being is so full. How can this lead me to something like submitting myself under the guidance and pastoral development of the Catholic Church? How does that work? So, and what I work on specifically, I'm looking at how Newman's turn to the subject in a kind of oscillating way that always looks to the subject's inward experiences, but also beyond, to history, to the sciences, both natural and theological, is a kind of iterative way in which we can come to a more and more adequate understanding of reality. And this inward turn, which he takes particularly in the Grammar of Assent, his great philosophical work, has been massively influential to both 20th century Catholic philosophers as well as secular philosophers. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example, gave out copies of the grammar to his students. Wow. C.S. Peirce, the process philosopher, deeply influenced by Newman's ideas of intellectual history. And beyond this, the personalist philosophers like Edith Stein, even Max Scheler, J.P. subject of his dissertation, and beyond this, 20th century developers of St. Thomas, Bernard Lonergan, Arik Shavara, all these people are indebted to Newman in many ways, as both someone to think with and also a great kind of friend who helps you see the world in all sorts of new ways. So, yeah. Beyond that, just adding a couple more, Newman was the founder of the Oxford Oratory, the first person to bring the Oratorian order here and set up in Birmingham, where he lived for most of, or I guess about half of his life after Oxford and then to Rome. He was also a poet and a great violinist, and The Dream of Gerontius continues to be one of his best-known sort of artistic works. He was a satirist and a polemicist, and in many ways is kind of patristic in the way he would just write pamphlets and enter into controversies, sometimes gloves off. But beyond that, it's really quite inspiring to look at just how faithful of a friend he was, to read his letters and to see how he changed tones with everyone he spoke to, whether he was giving them pastoral guidance, the young people, men and women who would write seeking his advice, or, the friends who couldn't get beyond their own kind of rational doubts. He would try to lead hand by hand, or even, just writing in Latin or writing jokes to others. It's amazing the kind of multiform ways in which Newman put himself at the service to whoever called.
Yeah, he's a real model of magnanimity.
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, yes. But a personal magnanimity, not the kind of Aristotelian, magnanimous, slightly aloof, reserved man, like someone who is very willing to wear his heart on his sleeve.
Yeah, the saintly kind.
I think so.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And we don't usually think of, at least I don't usually think of Newman first as a great philosopher.
Right. Of course.
Or a poet, even though I'm familiar with some of his poetry.
Yeah, he's also writing at a time, right, in the 19th century where this category of the great Victorian man of letters, who could kind of write prose poetically, or kind of dip into all of these different genres from theology to history. This is accepted, so in many ways it's more foreign to us now than it would have been at the time. Which is why often I find that Newman's style, some people love it, other people are like, oh, it's too Victorian. I can't get behind it.
Yeah, some of those long sentences, you almost need a diagram, right? When you're trying to read Newman. It can be hard for my students when I assign some Newman.
Yeah.
He wrote what's become a classic spiritual autobiography, right?
That's right.
His Apologia Providence.
Yeah, that's right. Interesting. It's, I almost caution people against reading the Apologia first.
Really?
When they ask, what should I read of Newman? Because it's not the Confessions. It's a little dry. And he wrote it in response to controversy in the press and ended up, it's a pretty inspiring story. He was a bit of in an outcast position at the time. He ended up writing in 1864. His efforts to start the Catholic University in Dublin had floundered. He had written an article about consulting the laity and matters of doctrine that made all of the higher-ups in Rome think he was a heretic. He was already persona non grata to the Anglicans, and so here he is in smokestack Birmingham, probably not even able to get a breath of fresh air in his lungs. And then, you know, some libel comes out in the press by Mr. Charles Kingsley accusing, you know, Newman of converting to the church in bad faith, and then in like 8 weeks, sometimes standing at his writing desk for 21 hours straight, you know, he sends this and publishes it in installments. And so, yeah, Newman even wrote to friends asking them to send him letters that he had sent them so that he could draw from them when he was writing the Apologia. So it really is like a history of my religious opinions. And there are, of course, like moments where the spirit soars and you get a glimpse into Newman's interiority. But that kind of like confessional, like dialogue between Newman and God, you don't really get in the Apologia in the way that I think you do in some of the parochial and plain sermons, and even at times in some of his novels, and even in the grammar, I would say. But it is still, regardless, a great work.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So with that mention of Dublin and the Catholic University, Newman is really important to a lot of us in education because of his influences there. Talk about a little bit, why is Newman important for Catholic education, and maybe even draw some connection between Newman and John Paul II and Ex Corde.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would have to, I must introduce you to my good friend, Dr. Paul Shrimpton, who is the real master of this. And I tip my hat to him.
I look forward to the conversation,
He was the one who actually introduced me to Newman by inviting me in the depths of the COVID pandemic to join a Zoom reading group on the idea of a university. And that was my first, it was the first time I'd ever read anything by Newman. And what struck me about reading some of the discourses was, you know, Newman's like, he's talking about the university and education, but he's really talking about the shape of knowledge, you know, and the division of knowledge, and how each science is its own domain and has its own first principles as well as its own methods, but they're all brought together and harmonized ultimately by theology, the study of God. The unifying principle behind all things. And it was very refreshing because here I was, you know, just fresh off my Harvard degree and having never gotten this unified vision of the university. You know, it's a kind of like, oh no, I am in my discipline and I do my thing, and other questions about the meaning of life beyond the meaning of this text I can't engage. So it felt like opening the window and suddenly getting a breath of fresh air when first time I read the idea of the university. And why is Newman so important for education? I think it's precisely because he gives this unified vision of the world, and ultimately truth not contradicting truth, but leading like a pyramid from its disparate four corners all the way up to, you know, the apex, the top, which is theology. And I think that translates so well into Newman's understanding of the unity and whole of the human person who's seeking this knowledge, who can really only come to an adequate vision or even embodiment of the truth if she develops all aspects of who she is, both moral and intellectual and imaginative and natural and supernatural. And so there's a deep respect, I think, and a kind of crucial way of understanding truth as, you know, fitting human development, and truth developing in concert with the development of the human persons who are the mediators of truth. And this is, you know, you see this in his university sermon, I believe it's number 5, that personal influence as the means of propagating truth, which is precisely this notion and reality of the university at its core is a core at core. It's a heart-to-heart conversation, and it's between the master and the pupil who meet and converse in this ongoing dialogue, and which both risk personal transformation, which is in fact the precondition for coming to any kind of shared understanding of this cooperative enterprise that we call the search for truth. And I think that this comes across in the university sermons, but it kind of ripples through everything Newman wrote. And you can really appreciate how this was a man who knew what real education was like, you know, in the trenches, as it were. I mean, he was a fellow at Oriel 1822 to 1845 and introduced a lot of reforms in the tutorial system. But crucially, I think for Americans, sometimes it's hard to remember that in Oxford, the education is especially at the undergraduate level, is a little different from, you know, one professor speaking to a whole lecture room full of people who take notes. It's one-on-one, like we're doing now. And I've given some tutorials here at Oxford, and it's an amazingly like intimate and risky experience. You know, someone writes something, the student does, and I read it, and then I look him in the eyes and I ask him questions about it. You know, and that's you can see how it would lend itself less to checking boxes or passing exams than a kind of soulcraft. And you know, Newman is also very careful in the university, or the idea of a university, to distinguish what we can expect from liberal learning, right? Like the kind of like self-development, we would say, that gives us something like the well-formed gentleman, or the person who has a view, who has a certain system of thought, and the kind of development that we would expect from a more specifically religious or Catholic education, which would, you know, involve way more moral formation and staying close to the sacraments, et cetera. So it's important to kind of keep these two distinct, and Newman is by far not saying that every liberal education should, you know, like, should ultimately like be intermeshed with what we would expect from a purely Catholic education. But you can also see, and I think there's a lot of data to support this, how the kind of liberal, global, structured learning he's suggesting would lend oneself with a kind of appreciation for the way knowledge does cohere in one whole, and then to go off in search of the meaning of that whole, and then ultimately find his way to Catholic truth, both capital C and lower C, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to that's a beautiful vision that he articulates.
It is, yeah.
You know, and he's able to see so much and make so many connections.
That's right. And I think too, perhaps maybe something that's underappreciated is just how patristic Newman was, because he's reading Augustine, he's reading Athanasius, he's reading Origen, he's reading Clement of Alexandria, and he particularly identifies with the Alexandrian fathers, who, you know, who like see the world as a symphony, see it as a great work of art by the great artisan, God himself. And something that you see in Irenaeus certainly, but I think all across the fathers Newman was reading, is this sense of divine pedagogy, that God is unfolding the world, unfolding history both natural and divine, through the lives of his persons, you know, the people that he has made, and especially through his church, to kind of to teach us, to tutor us, to help us grow and develop as both persons, as both a church, you know, as both in our understanding of the revelation that was given once, you know, through the incarnation. And it's such a beautiful picture of Christ, if it can be said, you know, with due reverence, as Newman would put it, like the cosmic Oxford tutor, you know, who's like leading us through and forming us in all the ways, this family of humanity, you know, seeking him and being made more and more kind of adequate to that relationship over time.
Yeah, so with this, with Newman's, there's a couple of different questions I want to ask. I'll ask them separately. So first of all, with Newman's ideas about the different domains of authority that different sciences have, and their interrelationship. So let's bring this back to faith and science and evolution now, because Newman is, of course, a contemporary of Darwin, who publishes The Origin in 1859. And Newman, so tell us a little bit about how Newman viewed the relationship between faith and science when it came to evolution, and how did he kind of model a Catholic response to this new discovery?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, it's interesting because Oxford was an early battleground in the whole perceived clash between faith and science and evolution and the sort of divine Christian story of the world. And you can just walk across the road and see in the Natural History Museum that the kind of imagination that time evoked, I suppose. So it's the museum itself is built as a cathedral to nature, and you walk in and you see these like high high Gothic archways, and where statues of the saints should be, you have like Francis Bacon over here, Roger Bacon over here, Aristotle, and then across the way, Isaac Newton looking at an apple, a stone apple on the ground, and then Charles Darwin right across the center, who's got this very stern stone look with a giant beard, looking very austere, etc. But, and there's a great evolution debate that was held there. I want to say 1860, but I need to double check that, between the Bishop of Oxford at the time and one of Darwin's bulldogs.
Yes, Huxley. Yep.
Yeah, Huxley. So
it was Huxley and, I forget the name of the bishop
Soapy
now.
Sam, right? Sam Wilberforce.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
So, yeah,
So,
Newman, it was a battleground, and
yes.
it's happening all around. And Newman, I haven't looked at this in much detail, but he was definitely not opposed to evolution. He was like, oh yeah, totally compatible with everything. Also, Newman had a very keen sense of the pervasive, transcendent power of God, the Creator, holding all things in being, the indwelling of the Spirit in all things, the way that God, is ultimately in providential control of all circumstance, right? So if it happens, it is the will of God that it was permitted to be the case. And so I think in that sense, it gave him a great kind of capacious, generous magnanimity, as you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And I think that definitely applies in the case of evolution. And in many ways, his whole outlook on life is premised on evolution, in the sense of development, both historical, doctrinal, personal, natural. And he has this wonderful quote from the Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, which was the text he was writing in 1845 when he ended up moving from the Anglo-Catholic to the Catholic Church. To live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often, which is great, as long as we keep in mind that there is a unified end to which we are all developing. And I think you also see in Newman a great love and respect for all kinds of learning. So all that he's talking about in terms of liberal learning and the harmony of all the domains of knowledge, he's very much embodying. So he had a keen interest in astronomy. He uses mathematical and musical metaphors throughout his works. You can tell he was a classics and mathematics major in undergrad. He loved trips to the zoo, and in many of his sermons speculates very whimsically about the inner life of animals, and it's wonderful. And he also had a keen interest in geology. I have a friend who's writing a research paper on this. I don't know a ton about it, but I could see how being in sort of Britain and being able to access so many different layers of both human and natural history, one could develop an interest in such thing very quickly. So in that sense, I think that Newman saw absolutely no incompatibility between the way he was understanding the world as essentially an unfolding of the divine economy, a kind of tutoring of the human family, and while it is swept up into the divine life, and to think about God realizing his purposes, as it were, through a narrative.
So for maybe sort of a last word here on Newman and faith and science and evolution. I'm thinking of two particular individuals who might be interested in this subject. One is the person who is religious, loves the faith, but is maybe skeptical of evolutionary science and somehow sees it as a threat to the faith, maybe. And on the other side, the individual who recognizes the data and the value of science and also thinks that there's a conflict and that either you have to accept the science or the faith. How can Newman offer sort of a last word here on either one of those people? How can they?
It's beautiful, and I
this?
love how you put it in terms of people, because that's exactly how Newman thinks about this. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Grammar of Assent is his great sort of the last attempt to summarize what has been his lifelong preoccupation with the relationship between faith and reason. And he wasn't planning to write it. He was planning to write a textbook on metaphysics, of all things. And then he starts, exchanging letters, as it were, with one of his family friends, who's a man by the name of William Froude. William Froude is the younger brother of one of Newman's dear friends from his days at Oriel, who's also a fellow compatriot, as it were, in the Oxford movement. And this was a man by the name of Hurlfrud. And Hurlfrud died in the middle of the Oxford movement and was always sort of considered a martyr among Newman and his other friends. So Hurl's younger brother, William Froude, grows up to be a great scientist. And he is a wildly successful naval engineer in addition to being an experimental scientist. And he is the hardcore picture of the rationalist who says, I have built my career and I have discovered so many truths about the natural world by always being confident of my doubts, certain in my doubts, dogmatically attached to my doubts, one might say, to always approach things as I can't accede, I can't assent until I have the certainty that this proposition is true. And so William Froude has a whole family, his wife and children, and Newman is, again, family friends with them from a very young age, and Newman talks with Froude's wife about the faith, Newman talks with his sons about the faith, and one by one, the wife and the sons convert to the Catholic Church, until it's William Froude on his own, as the one kind of dogmatic skeptic among his family. And he writes a very poignant letter to Newman shortly after one of his sons has converted to the faith, and says, you would have to convince me proposition by proposition that the Catholic Church is true, what it holds is true. And if you do, my principle of universal skepticism will commit suicide at the feet of certainty. And Newman reads this letter, and he scraps his plans to write a textbook on metaphysics, and writes a philosophical treatise to try to save his friend's soul. And you look at the examples that he uses in the grammar, and they're directly from some of the memoranda he was writing from conversations with Froude. And so I feel like you really have to recover the kind of intersubjective context of the grammar to really understand what it's about. And what's fascinating, this is my reading, but I think that Newman cautions us from applying the same methodology that is successful in the natural sciences to the question of faith. It's a distinctly different kind of thing, right? So on the one hand, we might be trying to figure out what is the best way to design the hull of a ship, or how do ocean waves affect the way that we ought to chart our course, et cetera. And so you kind of are suspicious of a hypothesis until it's proven true, and you can sort of evaluate the data as such, or even a mathematical problem or a proof. We would expect premise, and then a kind of tight inference to a conclusion that we can be certain of. But if we try to apply that to the question of religious faith, it's just a misapplication. Because what we're trying to understand here is not, some proposition, whether or not it's true or not. Like trying to fit the divine God himself in a proposition. If you did, he wouldn't be very divine now, would he? Like a God that you could figure out in a formula is not the kind of God who would, create the world as it is. He would create the whole system of intelligibility in which we find ourselves immediately swept up in. So the question is not so much, is it true? Because there's not like some kind of measure of truth out there by which we can measure God himself. The question is much more, is this system, this story, this way of understanding the world that we can piece together from the history and the data of both revelation and knowledge as we know it from every other domain, is it real? Does it explain the reality that we find ourselves in medias res caught up in? So this is Newman saying we have to reappropriate our starting point. We are human subjects. We're limited. We're very clearly creatures who don't have infallible knowledge, who can't know everything. And we are in a moral and an existential situation of trying to figure out the meaning of all things, of the summa rerum of all things. And beyond this, we have data that's available to us in our subjective experiences of consciousness, of conscience, of this sense of right and wrong. When we reason, we catch ourselves using first principles, like the principle of sufficient reason, that we can't even prove. Try to prove the principles of reasoning by applying them in some kind of syllogism, right? The intelligibility of the world is ultimately the reason that we have to take on faith. And so there's no escaping this kind of, entering into the world as we see it and risking a transformation when we do. So the question is really, okay, well, what way of understanding the world best makes sense of all the data as I find it? Historically speaking, in my own experience, from what I see in the people around me, and then how do I start moving from there to a kind of adequate story or explanation that can ultimately account for the givenness of the world, and can account for how I respond to it personally. Does it help me develop towards a greater natural flourishing and ultimately toward a kind of moral, virtuous happiness that is just everyone can see is the kind of way things ought to go? And how do I see enough of the drift of where all of that evidence is leading to kind of enter into it relationally and start to move from the kind of hermeneutic of suspicion to a hermeneutic of giftedness and gratitude and ultimately dialogue with God? Because if the truth that we're talking about here in terms of adequate explanation that ultimately transforms me as I start to see the world that way, the paradigm is not that of a mathematical proof, but of a human relationship. And the perfect way to not even get off the ground in a relationship with another person is to like approach with this hermeneutic of suspicion, right? Like, I don't even know if he's understanding me or if he wants to continue to, get involved with this. The way to develop in that kind of knowledge is to put oneself at the risk of being changed. So I think ultimately Newman is giving us a different way of thinking about what faith is, and how any kind of journey toward the truth is going to involve becoming a certain kind of person. So if we're able to kind of look at the sweep of history, of philosophy, of science, and realize that, as he put it in one university sermon, over time the whole philosophy of the world has been absorbed into the cross, then maybe we should try jumping in and starting a dialogue with that person.
Wow, that's a beautiful way to end it. So, wow, there's so much there with Newman, and I think you did a beautiful job of illuminating his thought for us. So, thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
And wish you the best
pleasure.
with your PhD.
Thank you.
And look forward to more great things from you. All right.
Great.
That was so much fun.
Great, thank you. I love Newman.
I do too, and I love hearing you talk about him. The way you talk about Newman.